Let's dive into a massive revolution in the American film industry. And we're going to do it by looking at two movies that, on the surface, could not be more different. Casablanca and Alien. Yeah, a classic wartime romance and a terrifying sci-fi horror. But believe it or not, together they tell the perfect story of how Hollywood basically tore itself down and was completely rebuilt.
So really, what do these two films have in common? At first glance, you'd say absolutely nothing. But they're like perfect little time capsules from two totally different Hollywoods. You can think of them as key pieces of evidence that, when you put them side by side, show you exactly how the whole movie-making machine was reinvented from the ground up.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll set the stage by looking at Hollywood's two major eras. Then, we're going to see how the business model of each time directly influenced the kinds of stories they told. After that, we'll compare the villains, the heroes, and finally, we'll wrap it all up by seeing what this reveals about that constant battle between art and industry.
All right, first up, let's get our heads around the two different worlds these films came from. We're talking about a massive shift from the old-school dream factory of the Golden Age to the birth of the modern blockbuster.
This right here, this is the world that gave us Casablanca. We're talking Hollywood's Golden Age, which ran roughly from the 1930s to the 50s. The whole industry was basically an oligopoly, run by just a handful of incredibly powerful studios. You know, the big five, like Warner Brothers, MGM, and Fox. And let me tell you, they controlled everything.
And the scale of production was just mind-boggling. At its peak in 1940, the studio system was pumping out over 350 films a year. The goal wasn't really to create one single masterpiece, it was more like an assembly line, a true dream factory designed to constantly feed movies into the theaters that the studios themselves owned.
And this timeline just lays it all out. You can see how much changed in the gap between these two films. Casablanca came out right at the height of the studio system's power. But by the time Alien hit theaters in '79, that whole system had crumbled. The industry's strict censorship rulebook, the Hays Code, was totally gone. And this new generation of film school directors, the new Hollywood kids, had taken charge.
So how did the business side of Hollywood actually end up shaping the movies themselves? This is where it gets really interesting, because the industry itself almost becomes a character in the story of how these films got made.
The secret to the Golden Age Studios' power was this little thing called vertical integration. See, they didn't just make the movies, they also controlled the distribution network, and they owned the movie theaters where you actually went to see them. It was a completely closed system, from the first word on the script to the final frame on the screen.
And you can see this so clearly with Casablanca. Powerful studio bosses, these moguls like Jack Warner, they called all the shots. Stars were locked into these long-term contracts, and the whole point was just to crank out a steady supply of movies. Now, contrast that with Alien. By then, the power had totally shifted. Directors had way more control. Stars negotiated their contracts for each film, and the entire business model was now about creating one massive blockbuster event that could compete with television.
Okay, so let's get into the stories themselves. What happens when you actually compare the bad guys in these two movies? Well, the threats they represent could not be more different, and that tells you everything you need to know about the thinking of each era.
You have to remember, Casablanca was made right in the middle of World War II. In fact, its production even got the stamp of approval from the U.S. Office of War Information. So it wasn't just a movie. As the film scholar Thomas Schatz said, it was basically an anthem. Its anti-fascist message was crystal clear, super patriotic, and 100% aligned with the government's pro-war effort.
And this gets to the absolute core difference between them. In Casablanca, the threat is external, it's political, it's fascism. The movie is proudly pro-establishment. But in Alien, the threat isn't some foreign enemy, it's internal. It's the crew's own employer, V Company. And the film's whole vibe is deeply anti-establishment and very critical of corporate power.
Yeah, in Alien, the real monster isn't just the xenomorph, it's Weyland's-Yutani. We find out their secret order was always to bring back the alien, and that the crew was totally expendable. They're just, as this quote says, expendable cogs in the capitalist machine, where a potential asset is worth way more than human life. It perfectly captured that post-Vietnam anti-authority feeling of the time.
So we've looked at the villains. Now what about the heroes? Let's dig into how the social and industrial contexts of each film gave us two radically different ideas about what it means to be a hero, especially when it comes to gender.
Casablanca is absolutely a product of its time, shaped by patriarchal values and that strict production code. The female characters, especially Ilse Lund, have very little real agency. I mean, her entire identity is defined by the men in her life, Rick and Victor.
She's literally shot in soft focus, presented as this beautiful object whose fate is ultimately decided for her.
This comparison here, which we pulled from one of our sources, just lays it all out so clearly. On the Casablanca side, it talks about how women are shown as marginal, objectified with lighting, and stuck in those traditional gender roles. But then you look at Alien, and it points to this much more complex, fluid approach to gender. It's a direct reflection of the massive social changes that were happening. The shift is just dramatic.
Right. Alien didn't just appear out of nowhere. It landed right in the middle of second-wave feminism, a huge social movement that was fighting for equality in the workplace, reproductive rights, and for an end to these old patriarchal structures. And the film absolutely soaked up all that cultural energy.
And the result is Ellen Ripley. She's just a survivor. She's a competent professional who takes command when everything goes sideways. She's what you might call a sleeper protagonist who rises to become the hero. And in doing that, the film totally flips horror tropes on their head and explores themes that really resonated with feminist concerns of the time, from workplace equality all the way to bodily autonomy.
Okay, let's bring it all home. When we put all these pieces together, what can we conclude from this tale of two Hollywoods? Well, it all boils down to that constant tug of war between artistic vision and the industrial machine that has to produce it.
You know, it's easy to look back at New Hollywood as this golden age of total artistic freedom for directors, but it really wasn't that simple. After a few massive financial disasters like Heaven's Gate in 1980, the studios got really nervous. They started taking back control, pulling in the reins on these directors to protect their investments. That era of the all-powerful director was actually surprisingly short.
And that's exactly what makes Alien such a fascinating film to study. It's a hybrid. On one hand, it's a commercial, big-budget studio blockbuster. But it's also packed with the artistic risks and deep themes you'd expect from a new Hollywood auteur. And this was only possible because you had producers like Alan Ladd Jr. at Fox working with the writer Ron Shusett, who were still willing to take a big gamble on a director's vision for a high-concept horror movie. They got it in just under the wire before the studios really started to clamp down again.
Which kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. If the industrial system of the 1940s gave us a film like Casablanca, and the system of the 1970s gave us Alien, what kinds of stories are being shaped by the Hollywood we have today, with its giant media conglomerates, its streaming wars, and its sprawling cinematic universes? Makes you wonder, doesn't it?